How to develop the Asian economies whilst at the same time handling the growing pressure from the West to protect the environment, tackling the challenges facing the continent. Now on BBC World News, the last in the series of Develop or Die.
Hello, I'm Zainab Badawi in a rather noisy Mumbai on this sunny afternoon. Welcome to Develop or Die, a series of programmes that examines the challenges around sustainable development. This seems to have become the mantra for the 21st century, but some in the developing world are beginning to believe that it's being used increasingly as a convenient argument by the developed world to protect their global economic dominance. We've looked at how the powerful economies of India and China and the Asian tigers, Malaysia and Vietnam, are trying to ensure that their development respects the environment without compromising their growth. The question is this: are developing nations being asked to do too much by the West about environmental damage they caused in the first place? To discuss this, I'm joined here in Mumbai by three of Asia's leading thinkers. Ramachandra Guha is a historian and writer on everything from Gandhi to cricket as well as the environment. He's listed by Forbes Foreign Policy magazine as one of the world's top 100 public intellectuals. Victor Gao, director of the China National Association of International Studies and a leading economist and businessman who earlier in his career was an interpreter for Deng Xiaoping, the Chinese leader responsible for starting the country's open door policy. And Ravi Singh, CEO of Worldwide Fund India. He was a banker for many years with Standard Chartered and Deutsche Bank, so he has experience of the world of commerce as well as being a passionate conservationist. Welcome to you all.
Thank you.
Ramachandra Guha, do you think that the West has been enjoying this massive big feast and is now asking the developing nations to help clean up the dishes?
Well, there's certainly an element of hypocrisy in Western policy, and I would distinguish between Europeans and Americans. I think Europeans are much more proactive, more sympathetic to developing country interests. But that said, I think the growth path followed by India and China and other such countries must be mindful of sustainability and environmental questions. You could have added to noisy Mumbai, noisy and polluted Mumbai. So I think it's in our own interest, in our own long-term interest as a society and a nation to take care of our natural resource endowment and match our economic needs and aspirations to that endowment.
Victor Gao, I mean, I know you may not want to play the blame game, but in China, is that what you say to the West? Look, you got rich by being dirty. Why are you trying to stop us doing the same?
Well, there are at least two ways to look at this. On the one hand, I think we need to differentiate the historical responsibilities leading all the way for more than 100 years, resulting in the current situation that we are faced with. However, finger pointing itself doesn't solve the problem. The other way to look at it is whatever the historical liabilities or responsibilities there are, we need as the mankind as a whole to look forward into the future. Now, anywhere in the world, including all the politicians, will disregard the possibility of global warming to his own peril. So I think mankind is faced with one single task and challenge of coming to grips with this huge challenge. And no one, by playing the finger-pointing game, will get the mankind out of this very difficult situation.
But Ravi Singh, that finger-pointing does go on. I mean, you hear it all over the place in Asia. They say the West consumes 3/4 of the world's resources. Therefore, they should take the greater burden when it comes to reducing greenhouse gas emissions because they were the ones who mainly caused it.
The majority of Asian nations, certainly the majority amongst the politicians and the other leaders in these countries, in Asia, Southeast Asia, South Asia particularly, agree with this argument. And they directly feel that they should not be asked to change something that they were not directly responsible for.
Nevertheless, the leaders of Asia do take that argument to all those conferences that they go to on trying to cut global warming and all that.
I think it's the political and business leaders, Zainab, who make that argument. Political leaders, because it's easier to resort to rhetoric than to concrete action. Business people, because they have a vested interest in the same model of economic growth. But I think ordinary citizens, scientists, thinkers, voluntary associations do recognize that despite the historical responsibility that Victor rightly talks about, in terms of our own environmental problems, the state of our seas, our waters, our forests, where our energy demand is going to be met from, how can we plan sustainable cities? We have to look within and forge our own solutions, and the blame game is a diversion from this urgent task of forging our own solutions.
Victor Gao, I mean, do you think that feeling is one that you do hear frequently in China? Because that's not the impression we get when you look at all the factories and how they're spewing out all that smoke and everybody wants to drive a car. I mean, you can't move in Beijing, can you?
Development is the right of all the people in the world, including, in particular, the developing countries. However, when we talk about development, and Deng Xiaoping said development is the hard truth, and that actually is the underlying foundation for China's rapid growth over the past 30 years. But talking about development does not mean that we have to follow the traditional footsteps of the developed countries. For example, they have been polluting the world for several decades, if not even a couple of centuries. We do not need to repeat that.
But you are doing that, though, aren't you? I mean, you just said a moment ago, Ramachandra Guha, I mean, look at the smoke and the haze here in Mumbai.
You're right. I mean, clearly the world cannot sustain a billion Indians or a billion Chinese at the average level of consumption of an ordinary American. Yeah. So we have to rethink, and possibly the rethinking has to be done at all levels. The Americans and the Europeans have to de-escalate their consumption, perhaps too, or have to forge new technologies, new forms of use of energy, and then they can work out ways with the developing countries on how to share it in an equitable way.
We'll look at that in a moment. But Ravi Singh, just where the people of Asia stand, I mean, Mahatma Gandhi once said there is enough in the world for everybody's need, but not for everybody's greed. Is that something that resonates with people in India?
This principle, this way of sustainability, the way of life, and to manage within your means or less, and leave a small footprint in the way you behave, the way you live, the way you pursue the actions of your life. This is embedded in most of Asia's culture and tradition, certainly in India.
But let me make one point, talking about the United States and China. The United States and China are the second largest importer and consumers of crude oil. Now, China consumes about 1/3 of the total petroleum that the United States consumes. But on a per capita basis, China only consumes about 1/13 of the crude oil that the United States consumes. What does this mean? Does this mean that the United States has a right to lecture China not to increase reasonably its consumption of oil? No, I don't think so. But on the other hand, does this mean that China has a right to go all the way up on a per capita basis to the oil consumption that the United States does?
Does it?
No, it doesn't.
It doesn't.
It doesn't, because
it doesn't.
Otherwise China will consume all the oil in the world. So we need to achieve a sustainable model of development.
I think Victor is absolutely right. There are sections of society in the developing countries who are consuming too little, who have to be lifted out of poverty, who need development. There are sections of society within the developing world and, of course, outside who consume too much. To go back to your example of Gandhi and Ravi's comment, actually, there are many Indians who completely disregard Gandhi's views on restraint and responsibility in their attitude towards nature. In this same city, Mumbai, there's a very famous Indian who is building a 27-story, 400,000 square foot house for a single nuclear family. So greed, acquisition is also part of the new India, the new China. And I think
you should be ashamed of that, you think?
Of course, there's a moderation that is called for, because it's clear that development is necessary, poverty eradication is necessary, but there must also be restraint and responsibility at the same time.
How do you deal then with these two parts of your nations, India and China? You've got an industrializing, westernizing, relatively wealthy middle class who consume too much, like their counterparts in the West, and then you've got basically the peasant societies whom you need to pull up and boost their growth. So how can you deal with both of them at the same time?
Well, it can be done, and I think that's where government policy is failing. That's where I think civil society, intellectual scientists are ahead of the curve, but government policy is failing.
We have a responsibility towards this. The degradation to the environment that Ram spoke about, the extent to which we see this degradation, I don't think we have very much time left before the extraction and the bad use of what's happening of our resources is going to take forward. I don't think we have more than 4 to 5 years before the rivers
all
and
over the world, or just India?
I would
you're
say
talking about?
we're talking from a nation perspective at this point.
From a national perspective?
Yeah, no, also from Southeast Asia to some extent.
Yeah, if I may add one point, 30 years ago in China, we talked about development and development itself. But now we are more and more talking about scientific development, which actually means sustainable development, because we now realize that if development is for development's purpose only, to the disregard of environmental protection, then it's not sustainable. It will come back to haunt you.
I'd like to bring in the larger global dimension here, Zainab. When the Western world industrialized, they had control, territorial and physical control of the resources of large parts of Asia and Africa. What we're seeing now, which is disturbing, which must be discussed, is as India and China industrialize and develop in this very aggressive way, they are increasingly coveting the resources of Africa. You know, just as Asia and Africa suffered because of European and American colonialism,
the new imperialists.
It's possible. And I think India and China could be playing a great game at Africa's expense.
Why do you have to grow?